If you're the type of person who watches these kinds of videos, you're probably a little perplexed as to why I'm comparing Steel Force and Magnum XL-200, two rides with very different ride experiences and reputations. You'll say that Steel Force is a smooth and graceful, if almost too civilized machine, while Magnum threatens to rip your legs off at a moment's notice. But if you take a step back and just look at the rides with the naked eye, you see that these two coasters look almost completely identical. And it's hard to believe when you stare down the near identical layouts, track styles, and trains that enthusiast opinions can differ so vastly. How can two rides which look so similar ride so differently? Let's find out with science. The year is 1989, and something seismic is about to happen in the coaster industry. On a tiny little peninsula dotting the shore of Lake Erie, the world's first full-circuit hypercoaster is about to open. Standing 205 feet in the air, Magnum XL-200 was and still is a behemoth, shattering the height and speed records held by my home park hero, the Great American Scream Machine, for all of 3 weeks. Unlike Gasm and all the other gargantuan arrows that came before it, though, Magnum was different. It had completely shifted focus, shedding inversions entirely and focusing solely on big drops in airtime. It was a bold new direction for the industry, which up to this point had been dominated by record-breaking loopers over the past decade. But Magnum was in fact inspired by a Japanese roller coaster, the venerable Bandit at Yomiuriland, which opened in 1988 and had a total height differential of 256 feet across its sprawling terrain-based layout. It is said that new Cedar Fair CEO Dick Kinzel saw a CNN report of the new coaster and wanted a similar ride for his own crown jewel park, Cedar Point. And soon the planning began in earnest. First came the bidding. Togo themselves almost got the contract, but in the end Arrow won out, proposing a 187-foot tall monster to just pip the height record from Arrow's own Shockwave at Six Flags Great America. But at that point, why not just go for the gold? It was decided to enter uncharted territory and officially cross the 200-foot barrier for the first time.
My, look who's riding the Magnum. 200 feet is pretty high. Well, what goes up must come down. Even when you see it, you won't believe it. The Magnum XL-200. Get to the point.
Fast forward 8 years. It's 1997, and while the hypercoaster is still a novelty, it is far from the groundbreaking concept that it was in 1989. In fact, Little Dorney Park, a regional theme park outside of Allentown, Pennsylvania, is getting a hyper of their own. The Steel Force was the 7th hyper to ever open, and at this point a few different manufacturers have gotten into the game, including Togo and the former Arrow CEO's new company, D.H. Morgan Manufacturing. A few companies have even tried their hand at the Hyper Looper with, mixed results. But the coaster world had 8 years to refine their craft, so why the hell does Steel Force look so much like the original attempt? When you observe these two from a purely visual perspective, the similarities are impossible to miss. Both have bright red, okay, Molly orange for all you fucking nerds out there, thin, Arrow-style internal guide wheel track, topped by boxy, old-school 6-car trains that seat 6 riders in each car. In fact, the 3 different trains have identical color schemes, boasting a red train, a blue train, and a black train. Both trains restrain you with a seatbelt and a single padded metal lap bar, and the rides run about a mile of track each. So far, so sane. Let's take a look at the layouts then. A long, semi-slow chain lift brings you up to your hypercoaster heights. There's a tight kink at the top to allow for the chain lift to disengage the coaster easily, and then a short section of angled straight track before you fall internally down the long crest of your 200-foot drop. The first valley pummels you with positives until you rise up into the second hill, tall and drawn out so you don't get that much airtime. The second drop brings you back down to earth before you rise up into the third hill, and both rides careen to their long, drawn-out turnarounds. Steel Force is a long, speedy Rose Bowl section, while Magnum tips its riders on their sides through its janky yet aesthetic butterfly turnaround. Now pointed back towards the station, Steel Force briefly rises into a mid-course where it hits a set of trims that Magnum already dispatched after its third hill. But now the real party begins, as both rides fly through a flurry of small airtime hills on the return run, dipping in and out of blue tunnels and tossing riders skyward before coming to an aggressive stop on the final brake run. It's honestly amazing to see just how similar the two are. Ride them both though, and you'll quickly realize that despite Steel Force's old school styling, the Morgan Hyper offers a considerably more modern ride experience. The Magnum feels unhinged, and a trip around its circuit will have you feeling like you just made battle with a mechanical bull. In the best way possible, of course. Steel Force, meanwhile, is civilized, smooth, and far more refined. How can that be, though, if these two rides have almost exactly the same layouts, run nearly the same trains, and even have the same color scheme? It's time to break out the math. Before we begin here, however, I wanted to give a big shout out to El Toro Ryan and his Problematic Roller Coaster series. His videos are chock full of great primary research concerning the engineering and design of roller coasters, and I wouldn't be making videos like this today without his inspiration and his research. We can trace the source of these wildly different ride experiences back to the drawing board. There is a fundamental difference in how these two rides were designed. In many ways, the debut of Magnum heralded the end of Arrow's old school design philosophy, ushering in the computer age and ironically rendering Arrow obsolete. Magnum pushed the boundaries of what was possible using Ron Toomer's old school pen and paper design philosophy, and it's kind of shocking to see that such a massive ride was hand-built on site with barely any computer intervention. As rides continued to grow larger and faster, accelerating at a rapid pace through the 90s in what many have termed the Coaster Wars, it became a practical necessity to turn to the computer. Yes, Magnum was a massive success, and it was ground zero for these Coaster Wars, but it was obvious that the engineering of the ride had limitations. I mean, this ride opened with up-stop pads. Not wheels, pads. I'm amazed that the early trains didn't fly off the track given the ride's comically aggressive airtime. No doubt a result of Ron Toomer's utter failure to accurately predict the coaster's speeds through its nearly mile-long layout. There are more differences beyond the drawing board too. Like the Arrows that came before it, Magnum was built almost entirely on site, with hand-bent and hand-shaped rails fabricated by only the most skilled workers. That manufacturing method practically necessitated a few significant design limitations, one of the major resulting compromises being tangent radius design. Making long, custom-bent sections of track that constantly changed in radius and banking were out of the question. It was, however, easy to bend steel rails at a constant radius consistently and accurately, and it was theoretically straightforward to calculate the g-forces imparted to the structure and the riders to these elements. So for Magnum, that's what was done. Alan Schilke, who worked at Arrow and ruined it, stated that Arrow used to use wooden boards to make his templates, and bent steel rails to match this wooden template and get consistent curvatures. And looking at any old Arrow design, it's easy to see this design philosophy in action. Take this drop. The crest of the drop is circular with a constant radius until the desired angle is reached, and the track quickly levels out to a straight section. Now contrast that to a modern coaster, which continuously changes radius the entire drop and never once reaches a straight section. Very different indeed. Well then, how does tangent radius design affect the ride experience? Now let's run through the math real quick. You may remember this from your high school physics class, but if you don't, traveling around a circular path requires a certain constant acceleration to maintain the same radius. Now think about when you're going through a roundabout in your car. You set your wheel to a single position. As long as you stay in the same circle, you won't need to move the wheel anymore. This constant turning force is known as centripetal acceleration, and as you probably noticed, if you ever took a roundabout a little bit too fast, this acceleration imparts a force on you. Now luckily, the force due to centripetal acceleration is very easy to calculate. F equals mv squared over r, or if you're just looking at the acceleration, a equals v squared over r. It's easy to design a helix like this to impart a constant lateral force, and if you look at a lot of old Arrow loopers, you'll see a lot of them do just that, finishing off their rides with a helix. Not to even mention the mine trains, which are just chock full of them. Now, drops and valleys do complicate things because the coaster train is constantly rising and falling in speed. It's not that bad though. If you recall from my previous video on the forces experienced by back row riders, since roller coaster trains are all connected to each other, the entire train is always traveling at a single speed. It can be treated as a single mass with the center of gravity at the middle of the car. So if we just pick the bottom of the valley or the top of the hill, we can easily get a good estimate of the maximum forces being imparted on riders. Let's do an example. If we want to apply, say, 3 Gs to the bottom valley of a drop, which will end up being 2 Gs and we add the free G from gravity itself, we pick our estimated speed, say 60 miles an hour or about 30 meters per second, we plug in the desired gravitational acceleration of 2G, which is 19.6 meters per second squared, and we calculate to find our desired radius of about 45 meters or 150 feet. Kinda cool, that wasn't so bad. Let's say we want to follow up that drop with the floater airtime hill now. If we're going over the crest at 20 miles an hour, we want to hit 0G, which means we need 1 G of centripetal acceleration to cancel out gravity. 9.8 meters per second squared, 9 meters per second, let's do the math, and we get a radius of about 27 feet. We're well on our way to building our own Magnum. Of course, there's a lot more at play. Now let's take our triangular airtime hill we just engineered. With our math, we get a radius of about 27 feet, and that makes sense if we look at a small floater airtime hill, but 2 different factors shatter our simplistic model, and the first is the coaster train itself. Well, let's return to the back row problem. We know since the entire train travels at the same speed, the back row and the front rows will go over the top of the airtime hill faster than the middle of the train, as the center of gravity, which determines the overall speed of the train, is not yet at its highest point. So the front of the coaster train is hitting the middle of that airtime hill, going much faster than what we designed. Now let's say the front car sails through the top of the crest at 25 miles per hour instead of 20. This is a bit of an exaggeration, but for the sake of our math, we'll just roll with it. So with our same radius, we get 15.17 meters per second squared, or negative 0.55 G, for just 5 miles an hour more. We've gone from floater to flowjector, so what happens if we go even faster? Let's say 30 miles per hour. Plug and chug, and now we're getting negative 1.2 Gs. That's strong ass ejector airtime right there. Now I want to go back to our equation and highlight this little 2 for a second. V squared over R. You want to know why the squared is significant? Because it means that the acceleration and the resultant force increases exponentially with speed. Okay, it's not actually exponentially, it's geometrically, but it's a simplification for the video, okay?
Nerd alert!
Basically, every time you double your speed, the G-forces grow 4 times as strong. And you can see how things start to get out of control quite quickly. Oh, but we're not done though. Up until now, we've only considered a single design point, which is the top of the airtime hill. The centripetal acceleration formula applies to the entire radius of the crest. And the top of the hill is where the train will be traveling the slowest. And every other part of the hill, the train will be going faster. So even in the middle of the train, where we are hitting perfect float at the crest of the hill, we're getting stronger airtime literally everywhere else. In fact, the airtime is the strongest at the beginning and the end of the hill, where the middle of the train is probably traveling faster. This effect is especially pronounced when you remember that the ascent into this airtime hill is a straight ramp, which offers no forces itself beyond the slight reduction in downward gravity caused by the angle of ascent. So let's see what our very simplified force diagram looks like in the middle of the train. In an instant, you go from 0.66 positive Gs to 0.55 negative Gs, which is the source of that legendary gut punch that only Magnum's triangle hills can provide. You do hit that brief moment of perfect float in the middle, but the forces jump up again past the crest until you land back in your seat. Now what if you're riding in the first car, the fabled magic seat, where you were going into your constant radius even faster? Jesus. 0.66 Gs to negative 1.2 near instantaneously. Nothing else feels like it. And this is why people say Magnum's airtime is stronger in the front. In reality, it's just as strong as the back car. Well, actually, the back car is a little less strong due to friction, but it's the sheer violence of the transition from practically nothing to strong ejector airtime in an instant. Now, the back ejects you just as hard at the end of the hill, but it happens more gradually, so it doesn't feel as insane. Now, this crazy jerk doesn't happen on more modern rides because the transitions are smoother and the airtime hills are parabolic, which allows for consistent and steady airtime from the initial ascent through the end. Hell, even the slowest, most mild arrows can offer comical gut punches of airtime due to their tangent radius design. Now take, for example, the hilarious runaway mine train at Great Adventure and its final hill over the water, which I have dubbed Magnum! The Magnum Hill. Now this works far better in the first car, but if you do sit in the front, you jump quickly from a valley into a triangular airtime hill, and you literally get launched into your lap bar. My friend once described the sensation as like receiving the Heimlich maneuver, and I love it. And now we've looked at the pure insanity that tangent radius design can bring to riders, it's easy to see why Steel Force feels so tame in comparison. Well, Steel Force is different because unlike Magnum, it has computer-generated and parabolic airtime hills. Sure, you get that whip from the front car, back car discrepancy, which is something that's unavoidable with every coaster, but let's go back to the parabolic airtime hill formula we saw in the back row video. Now, there are a lot of assumptions here, of course, but at the center of gravity with this parabolic hill shape, the airtime is pretty much constant from the moment the hill begins to the moment you land back in your seat for the next valley. Now, let's overlay this with the middle car of Magnum. The difference is honestly pretty funny. And there are other aspects which differentiate the two further as well. I wouldn't call Steel Force the paragon of heartlining, but it utilizes less of the low rail banking method I've discussed in my prior video. That sensation that gives you the hilarious tipped on your side feeling as you traverse through Magnum's butterfly turnaround. The Steel Force's prefabricated track also means the whole ride is generally smoother, as the rails weren't literally being built on site. Like most modern coasters, most of the track was fabricated beforehand and assembled like Legos at the park. And while the trains look very similar, the Morgan trains on Steel Force are a lot roomier, granting a ton more room between the rider and the lap bar with a seatbelt that has plenty of give. Now, I don't know if they'd be safe to put up with Magnum's airtime, TBH, but I would welcome their presence on the OG Hyper. Steel Force does have some old school characteristics though. It's trapped in this fascinating middle ground where computer technology was beginning to be embraced, but the advances that companies like B&M and Intamin would bring to the table were still a few years off. It has the Arrow-style chain lift that takes its sweet-ass time getting up there and requires a tight crest on the top for the train to disengage the chain. Now, B&M Hypers would remedy this problem eventually with the pre-drop, and then eventually drop the tight crest altogether as technology evolved. And it would be a lie to say that Steel Force is perfectly heartlined. There's a small transition leading out of the helix into the mid-course that really jerks the train around, giving everyone a sudden jolt of laterals before the train rises into the mid-course brake run. And that drop off the mid-course is pretty triangular itself. It feels way different than every other drop on the ride. If you're in the back row, you get tossed out of your seat for a brief second before the track levels out suddenly and you slam back into your meager padding. It's a little trip back in time in a ride that, at least in its design, was absolutely welcoming the future. So to bring it all home, we have the design limitations of aerodynamics to thank for the insane ride that is Magnum XL-200. It's no surprise that as technology advanced, manufacturers moved away from these frankly ancient building techniques, and with them, the insane jerky forces that they brought. But now, 35 years on, this old school design is what makes Magnum special. Many modern coasters push riders to the edge with long, sustained ejector airtime through gradual transitions, but none can match the pure ferocity, the unhinged, jerky ejector airtime that Magnum XL-200 offers. Long may it live. Thank you so much for watching, and I especially want to thank Deborah Ong for helping me put this video together. This is the first time I've asked for outside help with editing a video, and I think she did an amazing job, so let's give her all the praise that she deserves. If you like this video, I have plenty of similar videos that delve into the mathematics and physics of coasters in my Coaster Crash Course series. If you like to take things a little less seriously, I have plenty of videos for that too. Please subscribe to the channel, it really does help a huge amount for a small channel such as my own. Leave a comment on the video if you liked it, and be sure to give the video a like, and thank you, of course, for watching.